The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, a quiet hum of tension. Sunlight filtered through tall, stained windows, casting shadows on the aged wooden benches. Malcolm Davis sat at the defense table, his hands clenched tightly, knuckles white against his dark skin. He knew this fight wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about justice, dignity, and the truth that had been ignored for too long. At the prosecution's table sat the Hawthorns, a wealthy white family with an air of entitlement that made Malcolm's blood boil. They had contested the inheritance, claiming the will was invalid. Their lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit, threw condescending glances Malcolm's way, as if the very idea of him having a rightful claim was an insult. Malcolm's attorney, Serena Marshall, leaned closer to him, her voice low but firm. Remember, stay calm. Their goal is to rattle you, make you seem unreliable. We won't let them win that way. Malcolm nodded, drawing in a deep breath. He trusted Serena. She was known for her tenacity and sharp mind. A black woman who had fought countless battles in courtrooms just like this. But even she knew the challenge they faced. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Robert Westwood, had a reputation. His rulings often seemed to favor white litigants, his decisions marred by an unspoken bias that everyone recognized but no one dared to challenge openly. The judge entered, his presence commanding silence. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room, lingering on Malcolm a fraction too long. A shiver ran down Malcolm's spine. He felt judged, not by the facts but by the color of his skin. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. The trial commenced with opening statements. The Hawthorns' lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, stood first. He spoke with polished confidence, painting the Hawthorns as victims. "This is a clear case of a contested will," he declared. "There's no evidence that Mr. Davis has any rightful claim. The deceased, Mr. Allen Hawthorne, was a respected member of this community, and we believe his true wishes must be honored." Serena stood next. Her voice was steady, filled with quiet power. "This case is about more than a contested will," she began. "It's about fairness, truth, and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, receives equal treatment under the law. We have evidence that Malcolm Davis is the rightful heir, and we intend to prove it." As she spoke, Malcolm watched the jury. A mix of faces, some sympathetic, others cold and distant. Would they see the truth, or would their biases cloud their judgment? The courtroom grew tense as Serena laid out the foundation of their case. She presented documents, letters, birth records, and a will that tied Malcolm to the inheritance. Each piece of evidence seemed irrefutable, yet the weight of doubt hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Judge Westwood leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. His cold, blue eyes seemed to pierce through every word Serena spoke. "Ms. Marshall," he interrupted, his voice dripping with skepticism, "these documents suggest a connection, but implication isn't proof. We'll need more than paper to validate such a claim." Serena's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Your Honor, we will provide testimonies that confirm the legitimacy of this inheritance. We are confident the evidence will speak for itself." Westwood's gaze shifted to Malcolm. "Let's hope so, Ms. Marshall." His tone, though neutral, carried an undercurrent of doubt. Malcolm felt the weight of the judge's scrutiny pressing down on him. Whitmore stood, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "I'd like to call my first witness," he announced. The bailiff opened the door, and an elderly woman entered, frail but dignified. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Whitmore began, "could you tell the court about your brother's wishes regarding his estate?" The woman's voice quivered. "Alan was a good man. He always wanted to keep the family legacy intact. He wouldn't leave it to an outsider." The word outsider hung in the air like a dagger. Serena stood immediately. "Objection. Relevance, Your Honor." Westwood's expression remained impassive. "Sustained." Mr. Whitmore, Keep your questions pertinent." Whitmore nodded, but the damage was done. Malcolm clenched his fists onto the table. The insinuation was clear, even if unspoken. The inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about heritage, and Malcolm was being painted as an intruder. When court adjourned for the day, Malcolm and Serena walked through the marble corridors, the weight of the day pressing down on them. "They're trying to make this about more than the will," Malcolm said, his voice low. "They want to turn this into a battle of us versus them." Serena nodded. "It's a tactic. They're trying to sway the jury's emotions, plant seeds of doubt. But we'll counter it. We need to focus on the judge, Malcolm. Something's off about him. His reactions, his tone, it's like he's personally invested." Malcolm frowned. "What do you mean?" "I did some digging," Serena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Judge Westwood's family, they have history with the Hawthorns. Old connections, business dealings. There's more here than just bias. There's a story they don't want told." Malcolm's heart pounded. The inheritance was tied to more than just money. It was tied to history, secrets buried deep. And now, they were about to unearth them. The evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet city streets as Serena and Malcolm sat in her dimly lit office, papers scattered across the desk. The faint hum of traffic outside was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling between them. Serena flipped through a file she had received just hours ago. "Look at this," she said, sliding the document toward Malcolm. "These are property records linking Westwood's family to the Hawthorns from nearly 50 years ago." Malcolm's brow furrowed as he examined the documents. "Land transfers? What does this have to do with the case?" Serena tapped the paper. "This isn't just any property. It was taken from a black family during a time when racial tensions ran high. The Hawthorns acquired it through a series of shady deals. And guess who facilitated those transactions?" Malcolm's eyes widened. "Judge Westwood's father." "Exactly." Serena's voice hardened. "This isn't just about inheritance. This is about legacy and power. The judge isn't just biased, he's protecting a family secret. If this gets out, his reputation, his career, it could all crumble." Malcolm's fists clenched. "So they're using this case to cover up their dirty history." Serena nodded. "We need to bring this to light, but carefully. If we reveal it too soon or without solid proof, it could backfire." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. "How do we proceed?" Serena's eyes sharpened with determination. "We need someone who can confirm this. A witness. Someone who knows the story." The next morning, the courtroom was tense. The air was thick with unspoken tension as the trial resumed. Whitmore continued his questioning, focusing on details that seemed trivial but were laced with insinuation. "Mr. Thompson," Whitmore said, addressing Malcolm directly for the first time, "you claim to be entitled to this inheritance. But isn't it true that you've had no contact with the Hawthorne family until recently?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about the connection until my father passed away. He left me documents that proved our lineage." Whitmore's smile was thin. "Convenient, isn't it?" "Objection." Serena's voice was sharp. "Speculation and badgering the witness." "Sustained," Westwood said, though his tone was reluctant. Malcolm glanced at the jury. Some faces were sympathetic, others were clouded with doubt. He knew the fight was uphill, but now, with the truth about the judge in their hands, there was a glimmer of hope. During the recess, Serena pulled Malcolm aside. "I found someone, an old caretaker who worked for the Hawthorns. He remembers the deals, the threats. He's willing to testify." Malcolm's eyes lit up. "That could change everything." Serena's face was serious. "It's risky. If they discredit him, we could lose more than the case. But if he's believed, we expose the whole system." Malcolm nodded. "It's worth the risk. Let's do it." As the trial resumed the next morning, the air in the courtroom felt heavier than usual. Marcus sat beside his lawyer, Aisha, both aware that the stakes had risen significantly. They weren't just fighting for his inheritance anymore. They were battling an entire system built on centuries of bias and injustice. Judge Whitmore entered, his expression stern and unreadable. The gallery was packed, word of the case having spread through the town. People murmured quietly, anticipation and tension thick in the air. Marcus felt their eyes on him, some filled with hope, others with doubt or disdain. Aisha stood confidently, her voice steady. "Your Honor, we request permission to present new evidence relevant to the integrity of this trial." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "This better be significant, Counselor." Aisha approached the bench, holding a thick folder. "This evidence pertains directly to the credibility of this court and the fairness of this trial." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Proceed." She turned to the jury. "Over the past week, we've uncovered documents linking Judge Whitmore to a deeply troubling event in this town's history, a racially motivated act that left scars on many families, including Marcus's." Gasps echoed through the room. Whitmore's face paled. "This case is not just about Marcus's inheritance," Aisha continued. "It's about exposing the truth that some would prefer remain hidden. Judge Whitmore, decades ago, was a key figure in denying black families their rightful property, using legal loopholes and fabricated evidence. This isn't the first inheritance case he's presided over with bias. It's a pattern of injustice." Whitmore slammed his gavel. "This is outrageous. Unfounded allegations." Aisha didn't back down. "We have records, testimonies, and even a whistleblower, someone from your past who has come forward." The room fell silent. Whitmore's carefully maintained composure was cracking. Marcus watched, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of history in this moment, the chance to expose the truth, to bring justice not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the same system. Whitmore leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can destroy me with this? You're playing a dangerous game, Counselor." Aisha met his gaze. "The only danger here is to the truth, and we won't stop until it's revealed." The courtroom was still, the tension palpable. The judge's outburst had only fueled the room's anticipation. Marcus sat at the defense table, his pulse racing. Aisha had just put everything on the line, and now it was up to the jury, the public, and most importantly, the judge himself, to see if the truth would be revealed. Aisha continued, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "Your Honor, we've already submitted partial documents to the court. But this," she gestured toward the folder, "is the full extent of what we've uncovered. It includes a sworn affidavit from a former associate of yours, someone who witnessed the very actions that tied you to the racial discrimination that has haunted this town for decades." Judge Whitmore's eyes flickered with something dark, a mix of anger and fear. The words from Aisha's mouth had cut through him like a blade, and he knew the walls he'd spent years building were crumbling. "You are treading dangerous waters, Counselor," Whitmore warned, his voice now controlled but tinged with a dangerous undertone. Aisha wasn't intimidated. "You may have controlled the past, but you will not control this courtroom. You will not control the truth." She placed the folder on the desk, her eyes sweeping across the room to the jury. The tension was thick, but there was an air of anticipation. It was clear that Aisha's revelation had opened a door, one that no one in the room, not even Whitmore, was ready to close. Aisha continued, "We have testimonies from the descendants of families that were robbed of their land, families that you directly harmed. In the late 1960s, when the community was pushing for civil rights, Judge Whitmore was involved in the legal maneuvering that kept black families from claiming their rightful inheritance. These families were left destitute, some forced to leave town, while the land was stolen from them." Whitmore's grip on the gavel tightened. "This is a baseless accusation," he bellowed, but his voice shook slightly, revealing the vulnerability he had long since hidden. Marcus looked over at Aisha, his mind swirling with disbelief and anger. Could it be true? Could this man, the one who was meant to ensure justice, have been part of such an evil scheme? His heart felt heavy with the weight of it. This wasn't just a case about money. It was about his family's legacy, their rightful place in a community that had been stolen from them. Aisha wasn't done. "There's more. This trial isn't just about Marcus's inheritance, Your Honor. It's about justice for every black family who has been robbed, oppressed, and silenced. The truth about your involvement will not stay hidden any longer." The courtroom was dead silent as Aisha pulled out the most damning piece of evidence, an old photograph. She held it up for the jury to see. It showed Judge Whitmore in his younger years, standing with a group of men, their faces hardened with pride, smiling next to a legal document, one that had been used to strip families like Marcus's of their land. "Here," Aisha said, her voice steady, "we see Judge Whitmore with other officials who were involved in the manipulation of property laws." This photograph was taken just days before the land deeds of several black families were altered to favor wealthy white families, like the ones we're dealing with today. The judge's face went ashen. His eyes darted to the photograph, and his hands trembled. The dam was breaking, and he could no longer hide behind his gavel. Aisha had exposed him, exposed his darkest secrets. "You cannot," Whitmore began to stammer, but Aisha interrupted. "Don't bother," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The truth is out. The people know. The jury knows. And now, the question is, what will this court do with that truth?" Aisha turned back to the jury, her eyes sweeping over each of them, willing them to understand the gravity of the moment. The silence was deafening. For a moment, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, every eye fixated on Judge Whitmore. The tension was thick, and Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire life had led to this point, fighting for his rightful inheritance, for his family's legacy, for his place in a world that had always tried to silence him. And now, Aisha had given him the weapon he needed to tear down the walls built by hate and oppression. Judge Whitmore's face was a mask of fury and panic. His eyes darted back and forth as if searching for a way out, but there was none. His hands gripped the gavel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he was not in control. Aisha stood tall, her presence commanding the room as she spoke again, this time in a calm, deliberate tone. "Your Honor, we now know that your rulings are not based on law or justice, but on personal vendettas and a history of racial prejudice. How can we trust the integrity of this trial when the very judge presiding over it has a history of ensuring that black families like Marcus's are stripped of everything they have?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Whitmore seemed unable to respond. His mouth opened and closed as if he were searching for something, anything, to regain control of the situation. I don't know what you're implying," Whitmore stammered, his voice losing its previous authority. But Aisha wasn't done. "It's not about what I'm implying, Your Honor. It's about what's been documented, what's been witnessed, and what has now been revealed for everyone in this room to see." She turned to the jury, her eyes sweeping over them with a quiet urgency. "You have the power to make this right, to make the system work for the people, not the oppressors. The system has failed Marcus, failed his family, and failed everyone who's been left behind. But you, this jury, you have the chance to hold this court accountable." Marcus felt a surge of hope, but also a rising anger. The injustice he had suffered, the years of being looked down upon, of being told he didn't belong, had all been building to this moment. And now, to know that the very judge who held his future in his hands had been a part of that system, it was too much. "I will not stand for this," Whitmore finally roared, slamming his gavel down with force. "You dare accuse me of racism? Of dishonoring this court?" His voice shook with rage, but the mask was slipping. The cracks in his carefully constructed image were becoming too wide to ignore. Aisha stood her ground, unwavering. "You've dishonored this court, Your Honor. You've dishonored the law, and you've dishonored the people who trusted you to deliver justice." Whitmore's face turned a shade of red that Marcus had never seen before. His eyes were wild, desperate. "This is an outrage. This trial is invalid. I will not." Before Whitmore could finish his sentence, Aisha raised a hand, silencing him. She turned to the gallery, her voice now resonating with authority. "This trial has already been compromised, and it is time for the truth to come to light. The people deserve justice. Marcus deserves justice." The gallery, which had been quiet until then, erupted into murmurs. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly rattled by the intensity of the confrontation. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as the realization set in. Aisha was doing it. She was making them see the truth. She was turning the tide. Whitmore's face twitched in anger, but he could no longer maintain the same level of control. His hands trembled as he reached for his gavel, but there was no calm left in him. His authority was gone. The cracks in his mask were too wide to ignore. "I will have you removed from this court," Whitmore shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "You and your client. You will both." But Aisha didn't back down. She was not afraid of him anymore. "Your Honor," she said, her voice icy and unwavering. "You may have the power to issue rulings, but you do not have the power to hide from the truth. The people know who you are. The truth is out, and no amount of shouting or gavel slamming can undo that." The room was deathly silent. Everyone was waiting, watching for the next move. Marcus held his breath, hoping that Aisha's words had made enough of an impact to shift the course of the trial. Judge Whitmore, now visibly sweating, gripped his gavel tighter. "I will issue my ruling immediately. The trial will continue, but I will not be swayed by these baseless accusations." But as he spoke, the door to the courtroom opened. The bailiff walked in, holding a letter in his hand. Aisha's eyes locked onto the letter, sensing the shift in the air. The bailiff approached the judge's bench and handed him the document. Whitmore hesitated before taking it, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. His face grew pale as he scanned the contents, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The letter was a subpoena from the higher courts, a direct order to suspend his ruling and review the case further due to the revelations Aisha had brought to light. For a moment, it seemed as though time stood still. The judge's face hardened, his eyes narrowing in fury, but deep down, he knew that his time in power was coming to an end. Aisha stepped forward once more, her voice calm and resolute. "The people have spoken. The truth has been uncovered. And now, we will not stop until justice is served." Marcus felt a surge of hope, but there was still much to be done. The battle was not over, but they had made significant progress. The light of truth was breaking through the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down on Judge Whitmore. The courtroom was now a battlefield, not just for Marcus's inheritance, but for the very ideals of justice and equality. Aisha's words had cut through the air like a sword, leaving a mark that couldn't be erased. The once confident and authoritative figure of Judge Whitmore had been reduced to a cornered man, grasping at whatever fragments of power he could hold on to. His every movement now seemed like a desperate attempt to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had already begun its march forward. Aisha's gaze never left the judge. She could see the panic in his eyes, the sweat forming on his forehead as he clutched the subpoena. There was no denying it now. The higher courts had stepped in, and there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. But the battle wasn't over, and Aisha wasn't about to let up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve, "this trial will continue, but it will no longer be under your jurisdiction. The higher courts have ordered a suspension of your ruling, and they will conduct a full review of this case." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the judge's face darken. He had never seen anyone in such a state of utter defeat. Whitmore's grip on the gavel tightened once more, but the power behind it was gone. His words, when they came, were tinged with defeat. This is not how this was supposed to go," Whitmore muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Aisha took a step forward, her voice ringing out clearly for everyone to hear. "Justice doesn't work in the way you think, Your Honor. It isn't about holding power over others. It's about doing what's right, no matter who stands in your way. You may have tried to use your position to uphold your own biases, but the truth is stronger than any gavel you can wield." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury members, who had once seemed so unsure, now looked up at Aisha with respect. Even the prosecutor, who had been quiet through much of the trial, gave a small nod of approval. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The walls of oppression that had surrounded him were starting to crumble, piece by piece. Whitmore's face flushed red with anger, but it was clear he no longer had the strength to continue fighting. His power, once absolute, had slipped through his fingers. He looked down at the subpoena once more, his hands trembling. "You can't do this," he snarled. I won't let you destroy my career over some baseless accusations. Aisha's eyes were sharp, unflinching. Your career was built on lies and corruption, Your Honor. It's not destruction that you fear, it's accountability. You'll face the consequences of your actions, whether you like it or not. Judge Whitmore's eyes flickered with something darker, fear. For the first time in the trial, Marcus saw the man in front of him not as a judge, but as a man on the brink of losing everything he had worked so hard to maintain. A man who had buried his past in the hope that no one would ever unearth it. But now, the truth had found its way to the surface, and there was no turning back. The bailiff moved forward, taking the subpoena from Whitmore's shaking hands. The judge finally slammed his gavel down with one last, desperate attempt to assert control. But his voice faltered as he spoke. This trial is adjourned. Whitmore barked, but the words had no weight behind them. The damage had been done. The court officers began to file into the room, preparing to escort the judge out. Aisha stepped back, her eyes still locked on the judge. She was not done. Not yet. Marcus, however, stood there in stunned silence. His heart raced as he processed what had just happened. The tide had turned in his favor, but the fight was far from over. His inheritance, the wealth that had been stolen from him for so long, was still not his. But now, there was hope, real hope, that justice would be served. Mr. Davenport, Aisha said, turning to him with a soft smile. It's not over, but you've got the truth on your side now. Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I never thought I'd see the day when a judge would be held accountable for what he did. This is bigger than me, bigger than my case. Aisha's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. It's about all of us, Marcus. About making sure that the system doesn't continue to break us down. You just help make a dent in that. We'll finish this together. As they left the courtroom, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but they were on the right path. The weight that had been crushing him for so long had lightened, even if just a little. But it was enough. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The days following the adjournment of the trial were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, and the public's attention was drawn to the scandal surrounding Judge Whitmore. What had once been a small case, a battle for inheritance, had now become a symbol of the larger fight for justice in a system rigged against black families. Marcus, with Aisha by his side, continued to fight, not just for his inheritance, but for the truth to be known. The higher courts had already begun their review of the case, and the judge's past was being scrutinized. The community rallied around Marcus, his story becoming a rallying cry for others who had suffered at the hands of the biased judicial system. The day the final ruling came was the day everything changed. Aisha stood beside Marcus in the courthouse once again, this time with the full weight of the higher court's decision in their favor. Judge Whitmore had been removed from the case, and his career had been irreparably damaged. The higher courts had ruled that his personal history of racial bias and involvement in past injustices had made him unfit to preside over any future cases involving black defendants. The case was reopened with a new, fair judge. Marcus's inheritance was awarded to him, and the family that had contested it was left in disgrace. The judge's ruling was overturned, and the judge himself was reprimanded for his conduct. Aisha, as always, stood proudly beside her client. When the final decision was announced, Marcus couldn't help but smile. A genuine smile, the first one in a long time. The road had been long, but it had led to justice. Not just for him, but for every person who had been wronged by the system before him. As they walked out of the courthouse, Marcus turned to Aisha. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Aisha smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "We did this together, Marcus. The fight is far from over, but today we've won." And as they walked into the sunlight, Marcus knew that this victory would not just be remembered by him, but by everyone who had ever fought for justice. The unseen chains of racism and injustice had been broken. And though the battle would continue, the first steps toward real change had been made.